The sharp clang of metal echoed down the dim hallway, each step reverberating in Nurse Sarah Langston's ears like a countdown to something she didn't want to face. Blood, wet and thick, streaked across the floor ahead, but there was nobody. Just a trail disappearing into the darkness beyond. Her throat tightened as the hospital fell into unnatural silence, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow her breath. She was alone, but every instinct screamed that something was watching her. A few hours ago, everything had been routine. Sarah's last night on the job at St. Mary's, the hospital she'd spent the last 5 years working at. She joked with the other nurses, had her final cup of stale coffee, and felt relief knowing this was it. No more graveyard shifts. No more restless nights listening to patients mumble about the whispers. But now the light above room 313 was blinking, the crimson hue like an open wound. Sarah froze in place, her heart hammering. The room had been empty for months, closed off after a patient had mysteriously died. No one went in or out. They couldn't, not after what had happened. "Don't be ridiculous," she muttered to herself. Yet her fingers trembled as she reached for her walkie, static hissing in response. Silence. Suddenly, the call light flickered on. Her breath caught. Room 313? Sarah's feet carried her forward, though her mind begged her to stop. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, each step harder than the last. She could feel her pulse in her throat, a desperate, relentless beat. Halfway down the corridor, the smell hit her. Rot. Decay. The scent of something long dead but recently disturbed. She gagged, covering her nose with her sleeve, her steps faltering as she neared the door. Her trembling hand reached out, barely touching the handle before. Bam! The door slammed open on its own. Sarah stumbled back, gasping. The room was pitch black, a void that seemed to reach out toward her, like an abyss trying to pull her in. Her breath quickened, panic rising as she realized she had no control over her own body. Something was pulling her, beckoning her. Against every ounce of instinct, she stepped inside. The door swung shut behind her. Her flashlight flickered on, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The walls were covered in long, jagged scratches, like claws had been dragged across the surface in fury. On the bed lay a figure, motionless, covered in a white sheet. But from under the sheet, dark stains spread fresh, wet, bleeding. The stench of death was overwhelming. "Help me." The voice was faint but unmistakable, coming from the figure on the bed. But it was wrong. Too distant, too cold. Sarah stepped forward, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The closer she got, the heavier the air became, like it was pressing down on her chest, squeezing the life out of her. "Help me." She reached out and with a deep breath, yanked the sheet off. There was nothing there. The bed was empty, just stained with dark, sticky blood. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut again. The temperature in the room dropped, her breath coming out in visible puffs of air. The whispers returned, soft at first, barely audible, but then they grew louder, overlapping. So many voices, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Sarah's head spun, and she stumbled back, hitting the wall. Her flashlight flickered, and she felt something brush against her leg. She looked down, a hand, pale, skeletal, reaching out from under the bed. She screamed, stumbling backward, her heart in her throat. But as she backed away, the shadows in the room shifted. They weren't just shadows. They moved with purpose, taking shape tall, gaunt figures with eyes like hollow pits, mouths open in silent screams. They swayed toward her, their limbs impossibly long, fingers reaching out as if they were trying to pull her into the walls. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she bolted for the door, yanking it open, running down the hallway as fast as her legs could carry her. Her shoes slipped on the blood-slicked floor, but she didn't care. She had to get out. She had to leave. As she burst into the hospital lobby, her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold floor. Her eyes darted around, wild and panicked. She wasn't alone anymore. Other staff members were there. Dr. Hawley, her shift supervisor Rebecca, and even some patients. But they were all staring at her. Their eyes were wide, hollow. And then Sarah realized none of them were moving. She crawled toward them, her heart pounding as she grabbed Rebecca's arm. It was ice cold, stiff. She shook her, but Rebecca just stood there, unblinking, frozen. It was then Sarah noticed the blood smeared across their faces and clothes, just like the blood that had covered the hallway. "They never left," came a voice from behind her. Sarah whipped around to see Dr. Hawley standing in the doorway. His face was twisted into a cruel smile, but it wasn't his voice. It was deeper, older. "They died, Sarah, all of them. And you've been living among the dead." Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of his words, but then she saw it, her reflection in the glass door. Pale, gaunt, dark veins crawling up her neck, her eyes hollow. She was dead. "No," she whispered, stepping back. Her hand touched her chest, but there was no heartbeat, no warmth. Dr. Hall stepped closer, his body starting to distort, his face melting into something monstrous, his eyes empty sockets. "They've been waiting for you, Sarah, to finish the shift. You didn't die in the crash. You never left this hospital. And now, neither will they." The realization hit her like a freight train. The accident that brought her to St. Mary's 5 years ago, the one that left her in the ICU for weeks, had been fatal. She had never recovered. She had been one of them all along. Her scream echoed through the empty hospital, unheard by the living world outside. And as the shadows closed in, Sarah was dragged into the depths of St. Mary's, where she would serve an eternity alongside the restless dead. No one ever leaves the hospital. The monitors flatlined, filling the sterile hospital room with the high-pitched, eerie tone of death. Dr. Evelyn Carter stared in disbelief at the patient on the table. He was gone. Heart stopped, brain activity ceased, dead for over 5 minutes. But then, impossibly, his eyes shot open. A collective gasp erupted from the surgical team as Richard Hawley, the man who had flatlined before their eyes, bolted upright. His eyes, once brown, were now a sickly glowing yellow. His skin, pallid and stretched too tightly across his skull, seemed to shimmer in the cold fluorescent light. And the worst part? His mouth curled into a slow, twisted smile. "Miss me?" he whispered, voice gravelly, barely human. Evelyn stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of surgical tools, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. This wasn't a miraculous recovery. It was something else. Something wrong. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of what was happening. The man had died. They had called it. He was gone. Yet now, he was sitting up, eyes locked on hers with a hunger that chilled her blood. No, this can't be real," she whispered under her breath, her hands trembling. The rest of the team froze in place, wide-eyed, unable to move as Richard swung his legs over the edge of the bed. His bare feet touched the cold floor with a sickening slap. And then he laughed. A low, guttural laugh that vibrated through the room, echoing off the walls. The monitors around him flickered violently, and the lights above dimmed, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally. Richard's breath came out in visible puffs, though the room wasn't cold enough for that. And the smell, the unmistakable stench of rot, began to fill the air. Evelyn's stomach churned. This wasn't the man who had been revived. This was something else. Something unnatural. "What the hell is going on?" shouted Dr. Harris, one of the surgeons, his voice shaky as he backed toward the door. But Richard didn't answer. His glowing yellow eyes scanned the room, fixating on each person in turn, like a predator assessing its prey. Then he stood, slow and deliberate, his head cocking to the side unnervingly, like he was adjusting to his new form. "I saw things," Richard hissed, his voice a raspy whisper that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. "Places no one should ever see. I felt things." He took a step toward Evelyn, his face twisted with something beyond pain, something darker, more primal. "They sent me back." Evelyn's knees nearly buckled as she tried to process what he was saying. What do you mean, they?" She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She could hardly keep her breathing steady, her eyes darting around the room as if the walls themselves had begun to close in. Richard's grin widened unnaturally, splitting his face in a grotesque display. "They don't like when you cross their boundaries," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "I shouldn't have come back, but they sent me to collect." The air in the room grew impossibly heavy, thick with a malevolent presence. Dr. Harris bolted for the door, but before his hand could touch the handle, it slammed Med shut on its own. Everyone froze. The room now felt like a prison, the temperature dropping rapidly. Frost began to creep along the windows, and Richard took another step forward. He didn't move like a human. His limbs jerked, almost as though he were being manipulated by unseen strings. He cocked his head toward one of the nurses, Lauren, who had been standing motionless, her face drained of color. The light above her flickered violently as Richard's eyes bore into her. "You're next," he whispered, voice slithering across the room. Without warning, Lauren screamed. Her body convulsed violently, and she collapsed to the floor, seizing as Richard watched with twisted satisfaction. Her eyes rolled back into her head as her body contorted into unnatural angles, bones cracking audibly beneath her skin. Her mouth hung open, but no sound escaped, just a horrible, silent scream. Evelyn felt paralyzed, her legs rooted to the spot as she watched in horror. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But the sound of Lauren's spine snapping was all too real. Evelyn clutched the nearby counter for support, her heart racing as panic took over. Sweat poured down her face despite the freezing temperature. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but her body refused to cooperate. Every instinct told her that if she moved, Richard would come for her next. What do you want?" Evelyn croaked, forcing the words past a lump in her throat. Richard turned toward her slowly, his smile never faltering. "It's not about what I want, it's what they want. You let me die, doctor." He took another step, his eyes narrowing, glowing brighter with every word. "You brought me back. And now you'll wish you hadn't." And then, with a sickening crack, he was ripped in half. Blood sprayed across the room, coating the walls, the floor, and the terrified faces of the remaining staff. Evelyn gagged, her vision blurring with tears as she stumbled backward, slipping in the blood that now covered the floor. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was none. Richard turned to her, his voice dripping with venom. "You're the reason I'm here, Dr. Carter. You'll be the last." The shadows closed in around Evelyn, wrapping tightly around her wrists and ankles, lifting her off the ground as Richard approached. His face was mere inches from hers now, his breath cold and rotten. "They're hungry," he whispered, "and you're their feast." Terror gripped Evelyn's entire being. Her heart raced so fast she thought it might explode. Her vision swam as the pressure of the shadows constricted around her chest, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She felt the darkness pulling her, felt something beyond this world reaching for her. Her mind spiraled, trying to escape the horror, but there was no escape. The void called to her, a cold, relentless abyss. Suddenly, the door to the operating room burst open. More doctors and nurses rushed in, but as soon as they entered, they froze, their faces twisted in silent horror. They couldn't see the shadows, but they saw the blood, the broken bodies, and Richard standing there, grinning like a predator with his prey in sight. "Too late," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in Evelyn's ears. With one final agonized scream, Evelyn was yanked into the darkness. The operating room was silent. Richard stood alone, the shadows dissipating, the bodies of the staff lying motionless around him. His glowing yellow eyes flickered before dimming back to the dull brown they once were. He was alone in the room. Or so it seemed. A faint whisper echoed through the empty hallway beyond. "They'll be back." The clock on the hospital wall ticked loudly, the sterile, artificial light casting long, harsh shadows across the room. Dr. Adrian Pierce sat in the break room, staring blankly at the remnants of his coffee. His shift had ended hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. There was something different about tonight's, something that gnawed at him, tightening in his chest like an invisible fist. The hospital was too quiet, too still, like the entire building was holding its breath, waiting. The voices had started earlier in the night, faint at first, barely more than a soft murmur, like the hum of distant conversations in another room. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder, more insistent. Whispers, just on the edge of hearing, like they were coming from the very walls. Adrian had shrugged it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. 3 straight overnight shifts had a way of making you see and hear things that weren't there. But now, sitting alone in the oppressive silence, the weight of those whispers pressed down on him like a wet blanket. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread crawling up his spine. "Just go home," he muttered to himself, the sound of his voice strange and hollow in the empty room. His eyes flicked to the clock again to 34 Amayan, the dead of night. The worst possible time to be alone in a place like this. Adrian stood up, pulling his coat from the back of his chair, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like the walls themselves were closing in. He glanced around the break room, heart quickening, before shaking his head with a bitter laugh. "Get a grip," he muttered, trying to steady his nerves. Yet even as he said it, the feeling persisted. No, it intensified. He had worked in this hospital for years, but tonight, it felt like a stranger. He stepped out into the hallway, the sharp scent of disinfectant stinging his nostrils. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the empty corridor. His footsteps echoed unnervingly, and he realized with a jolt of unease that he couldn't hear anything else. No machines, no patients, no other doctors or nurses. Nothing but the endless hum of the building's electrical systems. It was as though the entire hospital had fallen into a deep, unnatural silence. Adrian's pulse quickened, and he picked up his pace, heading toward the elevator. His chest tightened with each step, and the whispering grew louder, closer, as if something was following him. He tried to ignore it, shaking off the irrational panic clawing at him. But when the elevator doors finally slid open with a soft ding, the lights flickered. He hesitated, staring into the dimly lit interior of the elevator. For a moment, he swore he saw something, a figure, faint, barely there in the corner of his vision. But when he blinked, it was gone. A faint whisper echoed through the empty hallway beyond. Adrian swallowed hard and stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. The door slid shut, and for a brief moment, the whispering stopped. He exhaled, letting the tension ease from his shoulders. But as the elevator began its descent, it shuddered violently, jerking to a halt between floors. "What the?" Adrian's hand shot out to steady himself as the lights overhead flickered again, this time more violently. The elevator creaked ominously, and the walls seemed to vibrate, like something was moving behind them. Then came the whispers again, louder now, almost deafening in the small space. Adrian's chest tightened, panic setting in. He pressed the buttons frantically, trying to restart the elevator, but the panel was unresponsive. The air in the small space felt thick, suffocating, and the faint scent of mildew reached his nose. His breathing quickened, heart pounding in his ears as the walls seemed to close in on him. Suddenly, the lights flickered out completely, plunging the elevator into darkness. Adrian's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, all he could hear was his own rapid breathing. Then ding, the elevator door slid open, revealing a hallway that didn't belong in St. Andrews. The walls were cracked, old, and stained with dark streaks. The air was heavy with the stench of rot and decay. Adrian's pulse spiked, his legs freezing in place as his mind screamed at him to turn back. But despite the terror clawing at his chest, something pulled him forward. He stepped out of the elevator, his feet landing on a floor that was damp and uneven. The tiles warped as though they had been waterlogged for years. The overhead lights flickered weakly, barely illuminating the corridor. Shadows danced along the walls, shifting and stretching, moving in ways that shouldn't have been possible. A chill raced down Adrian's spine. He was a man of science, of logic, but nothing about this made sense. He had been in this hospital countless times before. He knew every floor, every hallway, and yet he had never seen anything like this. The walls themselves seemed alive, pulsing with a faint, sickly glow, as though something lurked just beneath the surface. A faint whisper echoed through the empty hallway beyond. The whispers returned, louder, almost frantic, like voices pressed against his ears. They weren't just voices anymore. They were words, fragmented and disjointed, but unmistakable. Help! Get out! Run! Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as he quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the empty corridor. The air was thick, oppressive, and he could feel it pressing down on him, constricting his lungs with every breath. His palms were slick with sweat, and his mind raced with every conceivable explanation, but none of them made sense. His only thought now was to get out, to escape whatever nightmare he had stumbled into. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the far end of the hallway. Adrian froze, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes snapped toward the sound. There, at the very edge of the dim light, was a figure tall, gaunt, with skin stretched too tightly over a bony frame. It stood motionless, shrouded in shadow, its face obscured by darkness. Adrian's heart hammered in his chest, his legs trembling as he took a step backward. "Hello?" His voice cracked, barely audible, trembling with fear. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching. Adrian swallowed hard, his throat dry. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But his legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place by a paralyzing terror he had never known before. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as the figure slowly began to move, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it took a step forward. "No," Adrian whispered, his voice shaking. "No, no, no." His feet finally obeyed, and he bolted in the opposite direction, heart slamming against his ribs as he sprinted down the corridor. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of unseen voices chasing him, echoing off the decaying walls. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't look back. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the walls warping and shifting with every step. His vision blurred, the lights overhead flickering in and out, casting everything in a sickly, pulsating glow. The sound of footsteps, heavy and wet, followed him, growing closer with every second. Adrian's chest tightened with panic, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. His mind raced with desperate thoughts. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know how to get out. But he knew one thing for certain: if he stopped, whatever was behind him would catch him. He rounded a corner, and the hallway abruptly ended in a dead end. His eyes widened in horror, his breath catching in his throat. There was nowhere to go. He spun around, his back pressed against the wall, as the figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, slowly advancing toward him. "No, please, no," Adrian whispered, his voice trembling with fear. The figure's gaunt face came into view, its eyes dark and hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that dripped with malice. It moved with an unnatural slowness, savoring every moment as it closed the distance between them. Adrian's body trembled violently, his chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked gasps. His mind raced, searching for any way out, any escape, but there was none. Trapped. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long, bony, and tipped with sharp, blackened nails. Adrian pressed harder against the wall, desperate to push himself through it, to be anywhere but here. He could feel the cold radiating from the figure, an unnatural, bone-deep chill that gnawed at his insides. "No, stay away." Adrian's voice broke as he screamed, his words echoing off the decaying walls. The figure paused, its grin widening, and for a moment, the air seemed to still. Adrian's pulse thundered in his ears, the tension unbearable. Then, with a sudden bone-chilling speed, the figure lunged forward, its hand grabbing Adrian's arm. The cold was unbearable, spreading through his body like ice, freezing him from the inside out. Adrian's vision blurred, and his body went limp, his muscles refusing to respond. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. He could only watch as the figure leaned in close, its hollow eyes staring deep into his soul. "You were never going to leave," the figure whispered, its voice soft and chilling. "This is where you belong." Adrian's heart seized in his chest, and darkness swallowed him whole. When Adrian awoke, the fluorescent lights above him buzzed faintly, casting a familiar sterile glow over the room. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. He was in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, the steady beep of a heart monitor filling the silence. But something was wrong. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something unseen was pressing down on him. Adrian sat up slowly, his muscles aching, his head pounding. The room was cold, too cold, and the walls, they weren't right. The paint was peeling, the corners were dark and damp, and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the air. His heart raced as he swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his bare feet touching the cold, cracked floor. He glanced at the door, hoping to see a nurse, a doctor, someone. But the hallway beyond was empty, silent. Adrian stood, his legs shaky, and stepped into the hallway. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as the familiar whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each step he took. "Help! You can't leave. You're trapped." Adrian's chest tightened with dread as he walked down the hall. Every door he passed was closed, but behind them, he could hear faint scratching sounds, like something trying to claw its way out. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Get out. Run. Run." But there was nowhere to run. The hospital was a maze, the walls warping and shifting around him, twisting and stretching, leading him in circles. No matter how far he walked, he always ended up back in the same place, the same cracked walls, the same flickering lights, the same dead end. Adrian's breath caught in his throat as a familiar figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It stood motionless, its hollow eyes locked on him, its grotesque grin spreading wider with every passing second. "You can't leave," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in Adrian's mind. "This is where you belong." Adrian's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, his body trembling with fear. Tears filled his eyes as the figure slowly advanced, its twisted grin filling his vision. The hospital wasn't just a place anymore. It was a prison, a living nightmare, and Adrian was its latest victim. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him whole was the sound of the whispers, growing louder, echoing endlessly in his mind.